Live us all. There will never be another Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis.
Though she avoided publicity, Jacqueline Onassis taped a number of hours of interviews in the 60s. Those tapes are at the Kennedy Library in Boston and won't be released until the year 2067. And Bill O'Reilly will be back in London when we return.
Outpouring of condolences and tributes follows the death of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Headline News. I'm Gordon Graham. The former First Lady who inspired millions for 4 tragic days in November of 1963 is being remembered as a woman of enduring courage. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died last night at her New York apartment after a 4-month battle with lymph cancer. Her children, Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg and John F. Kennedy Jr., were among the family and friends at her bedside during her final hours. Funeral arrangements are pending, but a spokesperson for the family says services will be private. Ordinary Americans and personal friends are offering their words of remembrance.
She brought to, I think, the national scene a great many qualities that we strive for: grace, sophistication, elegance, and yet I think what she's going to be remembered for is the sad and tragic assassination of her husband. And there's a sad irony in that, because she was a woman with a pixie sense of humor. She delighted in playing pranks on old friends, and she had a wit, but it was reserved for people who were close to her.
The White House will at minimum make a military transport plane and honor guard available to Onassis' family. In a statement released last night, President Clinton said Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was a model of courage and dignity for all Americans and all the world. More than any other woman of her time, she captivated our nation and the world with her intelligence, elegance, and grace. Even in the face of impossible tragedy, she carried the grief of her family and our nation with a calm power that somehow reassured all of us who mourned. Our thoughts and prayers are with her children and grandchildren and her entire family as we grieve over the passing of such a cherished friend. The president traces his interest in politics to her husband. Since moving into the White House, the first couple had developed a relationship with Mrs. Onassis. Wolf Blitzer has that.
The Kennedys have meant a lot to Bill Clinton, something Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis understood and welcomed. As a teenager, he came to the White House to meet President Kennedy in the Rose Garden, and he says he was deeply affected. Indeed, on the morning of his own inauguration, Mr. Clinton went first to Arlington National Cemetery to lay a wreath at the Kennedy gravesite. He was joined by Senator Edward Kennedy, the late president's youngest brother. Last October, Mr. Clinton was able to keep up the symbolic relationship, joining Mrs. Onassis and other family members at the dedication of a new wing of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston.
He inspired millions of us to take a very personal responsibility for moving our country forward and for advancing the cause of freedom throughout the world.
To many observers, the Clinton and Kennedy presidencies seem to have much in common: 2 young and energetic men trying to change the world. The 2 first ladies also seem to have something in common, despite their different eras: youth, a country's fascination, and young children living in the White House under the constant glare of cameras.
I've also had wonderful conversations with Mrs. Onassis, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, whom I admire greatly and whom I've talked with about how she protected her children and what she did to give them a normal life.
Last summer, the Clinton-Kennedy connection was strengthened when the President and First Lady vacationed on Martha's Vineyard and were invited to go boating with Mrs. Onassis, her longtime companion Maurice Templesman, and their families. The President says he and Mrs. Clinton are grateful to Mrs. Onassis.
She's been quite wonderful to my wife and to my daughter and to all of us.
White House officials say the President and First Lady will almost certainly show their admiration for Mrs. Onassis by attending her funeral. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, the White House.
Headline News. I'm Gordon Graham. America is mourning the death of a former First Lady, remembered for her poise and courage after her husband was assassinated 30 years ago. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died last night from lymph cancer. A family spokesperson says funeral services for Mrs. Onassis will be private. Gary Tuckman has more on her final hours.
With all the pictures, film, and video that have been taken of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis through the years, perhaps none are as memorable as those where she is with her husband, the president, and their children, John and Caroline. So many of those family images were of happy times, but so many others were of sad, tragic times. Images like daughter Caroline leaving her mother's New York apartment shortly after she passed away from cancer. Nieces and nephews were also by her side. Nieces like Maria Shriver and nephews like William Kennedy Smith. Former First Lady Nancy Reagan talked to CNN shortly after Mrs. Onassis' death.
Well, you think of all that Mrs. Onassis meant to this country, and the imprint that she left. I don't think there's any woman in history, well, very few anyway, who touched us all the way that she did. She was a remarkable woman in many ways.
Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis returned to her home from the hospital because doctors said nothing more could be done for her because her cancer was in such an advanced state. Throughout the day, family members like son John and daughter Caroline came to be by her side. So did people like her sister Lee Radziwill, her nephew Joe Kennedy, congressman from Massachusetts, and brother-in-law Senator Edward Kennedy. A Monsignor from Mrs. Onassis' parish church arrived at her apartment in the afternoon to perform the Catholic sacrament of the sick, which is given to seriously ill people. About 7 hours later, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, photographed just this past Sunday with her loved ones in New York Central Park, passed away.
Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis is being remembered as a woman who kept her privacy despite her life in the public spotlight. President Clinton called Mrs. Onassis a model of courage and dignity whose intelligence, elegance, and grace captivated America and the world more than any other woman. Former President Reagan says few women throughout history have touched the hearts and shaped the dreams of Americans more profoundly than Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. She was the closest thing to American royalty, whose style and flair were admired by Americans from all layers of society. Ordinary Americans are also paying tribute to the former First Lady.
Well, I've always admired her, that she's been able to retain dignity and not comment on anything involving either Onassis or John Kennedy, and I think she's someone to be respected for that.
She's just endured. She reminds me of apple pie, you know? I mean, she does. She just reminds you of the type of person that you're always going to remember, you know? I don't know if anybody really remembers her husband as much as they remember her, but I think she brought class to the United States.
I always felt she was a little sad all the time. That's what all the, riches and glamour, the politics and all that. I just didn't think she was a very happy person.
Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, dead at age 64. A life composed of brief, shining moments and terrible tragedies comes to a quiet end. Headline News. I'm Gordon Graham. As recently as Sunday, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was photographed strolling in New York Central Park. On Monday, she re-entered New York Hospital suffering from serious complications of the lymphatic cancer that was diagnosed in January. On Wednesday, she went home when doctors said there was nothing more they could do. And last night, she died. Relatives and friends had filed in and out of her Fifth Avenue apartment for 2 days, while crowds of people who felt like family kept a sidewalk vigil. The former First Lady's brother-in-law, Senator Ted Kennedy, flew back and forth between New York and Washington. Mark Leff reports on the life that inspired such devotion and endured such heartbreak.
This was not the image Americans had of their first ladies midway through the 20th century. At 31, the woman born Jacqueline Bouvier was not the nation's youngest presidential wife ever, but after decades of looking to older couples for leadership, people liked the fresh new look of Jack and Jackie. The young woman, dubbed 1947's Queen Debutante, had a privileged youth, good family, good schools, a good job as a journalist, and a good marriage in 1953 to the wealthy young senator from Massachusetts. 2 children followed, the first a girl, and after a sometimes lonely path,